afternoon and welcome to Simon Cook of Sullivan and Worcester, who has been our legal eagle in the Supply Chain Finance Roundtable. Simon, we were hearing earlier in the week at one of your splendid breakfast seminars about the actual underlying structure of the various types of supply chain finance arrangements in place and the basic principles of true sale and the quality of the receivable. Would you like to share with us a bit more about that and why this underpins the whole thing?
Well, I think, Clarissa, the concept of the structures that I was talking about previously form part of what we would call supply chain finance.
Yeah.
Obviously, it covers a raft of other things, but in terms of concentrating on the buyer-led, the supplier-led, and the platform-related structures, I think the fundamentals are equally as important as they are in any other form of structured finance transaction. What is key is doing the diligence, understanding the corporates, understanding the structures, where the inherent risks lie, and making sure that gaps are not left in the transaction. So we were talking in the roundtable a little bit about risk and the fact that what underpins not just these sorts of structures but all trade finance structures is a receivable. Yes. That is what repays the financer. It does, wherever it comes from, whatever form it takes, it is that payment obligation which ultimately repays the debt. Yeah. So understanding what that is, how it works, is crucial to making sure you have a structure that works. So if we look at a receivable, if it's a receivable payable under a contract, for example, certainly you can purchase that receivable, but you need to know about that receivable. When is it payable? Who is going to be paying it? What are the payment terms? If you look at something as broad as an oil receivable, for example, it may be that there's a price adjustment possible within the terms of the contract, depending on the grade produced. Yeah. If you're looking at something else which doesn't have that grading, then it may just be a simple rejection right if it doesn't fulfill the criteria, and so you no longer have a payable. So it depends very much where you're financing, and if in the stream you are financing before a buyer has taken delivery and accepted the delivery, then your risk is not only on the buyer but also on the supplier. Has he performed under the contract? Are there any get-outs for the buyer under that contract? Can he set off? Can he adjust the price? Can he reject the goods? Leaving you, the financer, in trouble. If you are financing a buyer under a buyer-led structure, where the buyer effectively accepts the delivery and confirms to the bank that it has accepted the delivery prior to the bank having to finance, then it's a much easier decision for the bank to make. Yeah. It's purely a credit decision at that point. Having said that, what the bank needs to do is look at that in the round, not just the buyer. Are there any credit enhancement available? Is there an LC backing this contractual payment? Have they issued a separate independent prom note to cover it off? Because the ideal situation for the bank is to have taken a transfer of the receivable, have the buyer confirm this, but at the same time have an independent payment undertaking of some description, completely separate from the underlying commercial arrangement. If they can achieve that, then in theory, depending on where your buyer is, you should be able to rely on that separate independent debt instrument, the promissory note, for example, even if there are problems with the contracts and the delivery, because the buyer has accepted and therefore has accepted the risk if things go wrong. Whether you can then enforce that in the buyer's jurisdiction is a separate matter that needs also to be diligenced.
Are there any sort of war stories of things that haven't gone quite to plan that have hit the courts that you could share with us, or has it all been plain sailing? I
wouldn't say it's all been plain sailing. There are difficult. It's difficult to pick out ones that you can actually talk about.
Oh, quite. That's why I asked you.
Yes, I thought you might. I mean, certainly, you do have situations where, for example, you might have double funding.
Oh dear.
And so you could have a situation where your supplier, you're financing your supplier, they have provided you with a wonderful original invoice. Here, this is what I'm selling to you. This wonderful buyer owes you lots of money and they're really good credit. Please give me some money.
Yes.
Unfortunately, the supplier has colluded with the buyer and has produced more than one original of the invoice and takes the invoice to a second bank to get funding from them. In that sort of situation, you occasionally see that. I mean, that's a straightforward fraud.
Yes.
And all of the things that go with that. But equally, it may not be a fraudulent situation. You may have a situation where, for example, the supplier has provided a notice requiring the buyer to pay to a certain account. This all works, everybody's happy with that. But then subsequently, there's an alternative instruction provided. The buyer pays elsewhere. He says, well, I paid in accordance with the instruction that was given to me. So I'm off the hook, I don't have to pay again. Meanwhile, the bank is there chasing the supplier and hasn't got the money. So what does it do? Now, obviously that's a bit more difficult where, if it's not a fraud, where the buyer is involved in the process. But many of these transactions are undisclosed to the buyer.
Oh dear.
And so from the bank's point of view, they just need to be careful as to who is controlling the process, and they need to monitor very closely what's going on. And if they keep monitoring, then they ought to be able to pick up any problems very quickly.
Okay. So we're back to basics, really. We're back to,
very much so.
Back to basics of doing the due diligence, checking the status of your counterparties, and just passing the smell test.
Exactly, and not just doing the sort of commercial diligence on the parties, but the legal due diligence. And not just, again, from the English law, if you're buying under an English law document, don't forget the local situation. If your buyer is in a country in, say, Africa or Asia, wherever they are, find out from lawyers in those jurisdictions, is your documentation going to work? You know, it may say all the right things on the face of it, but if in practice it's not going to be enforceable in that country, which is where the debtor is, then you might struggle if there is a problem.
Indeed. Well, on that optimistic note, I'm going to thank you for your thoughts on this, and wish you a very pleasant journey back to your law firm.
Thank you very much.
It's been a very good conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Simon.
Bye-bye.